He humiliated me for earning less than him, but when he lost everything, I was the one who helped him. From the outside, their marriage seemed picture perfect. Andrew was a successful financial analyst at a prestigious firm, earning a salary that afforded them a comfortable life in an upscale apartment. Olivia, on the other hand, worked as a freelance graphic designer, making a modest but steady income. Friends and family admired them: Andrew, the charming, ambitious man, and Olivia, the kind and creative woman who always supported him. But beneath this illusion, cracks had begun to form. Small, nearly imperceptible shifts in Andrew's behavior slowly eroded the love and respect that had once defined their relationship. At first, it was subtle. He would sigh whenever she mentioned her projects, offering forced nods and disinterested hums. When friends asked about her work, he would downplay it, calling it a hobby rather than a profession. Olivia noticed these things but chose to ignore them, believing that love meant understanding, accepting flaws, and making sacrifices. After all, Andrew worked long hours, and she knew stress could make people behave differently. But over time, his words became sharper, his tone more condescending, and the way he looked at her shifted from admiration to mild annoyance. Then came the first public humiliation. They were at a dinner with Andrew's colleagues when one of them casually asked Olivia about her career. Before she could answer, Andrew let out a short laugh. "Oh, she designs little logos and things. It keeps her busy." The group chuckled politely, and Olivia's face burned with embarrassment. She wanted to correct him, to tell them about the major projects she had worked on, but the dismissive way he spoke made her feel like nothing she said would matter. Instead, she swallowed her pride and smiled weakly, brushing it off as a joke. Andrew's success in his firm only inflated his ego. Promotions came quickly, and with each raise, his confidence grew, not just in his professional life but in his marriage as well. He began believing he was the foundation of their household, the one who truly mattered. Money, to him, was the ultimate measure of worth, and Olivia's inability to contribute significantly made him see her as lesser, even if he never said it outright. At first, his comments were playful jabs, small remarks about how he was paying for everything or how lucky Olivia was that she didn't have to worry about real work. But soon, they turned into outright belittlement. If Olivia bought something new, he would sigh and say, "That's my money you're spending." If she suggested a vacation, he would shake his head and smirk, "Maybe when you start making real money, we can do that." What hurt most wasn't the words themselves, but the way he said them, like he was enjoying making her feel insignificant. What was once a marriage of love and partnership became a relationship built on power imbalance. Olivia no longer felt like an equal, she felt like an accessory, a decoration in Andrew's life rather than a partner. She tried to talk to him, to express how his words hurt her, but every attempt was met with dismissiveness. "You're overreacting," he'd say, rolling his eyes. "I'm just joking. Can't you take a joke?" One night, she mustered the courage to tell him how his words were affecting her. "Andrew, I feel like you don't respect what I do. I work hard too." He looked at her and smirked. "Olivia, let's be honest. What you do doesn't compare to my job. You make some money, sure, but at the end of the day, I'm the one keeping this household running." His voice was smooth, confident, as if he truly believed she should be grateful for him. That night, Olivia lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the man she married had always been this way or if success had changed him. The first time Olivia truly felt humiliated in public was at a formal dinner Andrew's company hosted. Surrounded by executives and their elegant spouses, she listened as conversations revolved around promotions, investments, and success stories. When someone asked her what she did, she smiled and started explaining her freelance design work, but before she could finish, Andrew let out a short laugh. "Oh, Olivia? She just dabbles in little artsy projects. It keeps her busy while I handle the real responsibilities." His words were casual, his tone almost affectionate, but the implication was clear: what she did didn't matter. A few people chuckled politely, though some exchanged awkward glances. Olivia's face burned as she tried to force a smile, pretending it didn't hurt. She wanted to correct him, to say that she worked with real clients, that she had built her own reputation, but she could already see the disinterest in their faces. That night, she barely spoke on the drive home. Andrew, oblivious, chatted about work, completely unaware of how deeply his words had wounded her. As they pulled into their driveway, she realized something. To him, her worth wasn't defined by her passion or skills, but by how much money she contributed. Olivia noticed the shift in Andrew's behavior over time. At the beginning of their marriage, he would praise her creativity, telling friends how talented she was. But as his career advanced and his salary increased, the admiration faded, replaced by veiled condescension. The way he looked at her changed. There was no longer the same warmth in his eyes when she spoke about her work. Instead, there was a dismissiveness, a silent judgment that made her second-guess herself. The little things, his patience, his affectionate gestures, became scarce, and she felt as if she had to prove her worth every day just to receive the love that once came freely. She tested it one evening, suggesting they take a weekend trip together. "I found this beautiful little cabin by the lake," she said excitedly. "We could use some time to relax." Andrew barely looked up from his phone. "That sounds expensive. Maybe when you start making enough to pay for half." The words cut deep, not just because of the financial aspect, but because of the underlying message. Her value in their relationship was now tied to her earnings. She swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded, knowing that if she pushed further, he would only roll his eyes and tell her she was being dramatic. Andrew's mother had never truly approved of Olivia. In the early years of their marriage, she had tolerated her, offering polite smiles and shallow compliments. But as Andrew's career flourished, her opinions became less restrained. "You know," she told him one evening during a family dinner, "a man like you deserves a wife who matches his ambitions. It's a shame Olivia isn't more driven." Andrew didn't defend his wife. He simply sighed and took another sip of his wine, as if he agreed but didn't want to say it aloud. Olivia sat there, gripping her fork, pretending not to hear. Later that night, as they drove home, she finally asked, "Do you really think that? That I'm not ambitious enough for you?" Andrew exhaled heavily, his fingers tapping the steering wheel. "I just think you could do more with your time, Olivia. You're smart. You could be making real money instead of treating this like a hobby." The words lingered in the air, heavy with judgment. Olivia turned to look out the window, hiding the tears threatening to form. In that moment, she realized that Andrew no longer saw her as his equal, he saw her as a disappointment. Olivia had always dreamed of starting her own design agency. She had built a small but loyal clientele and had begun working on a website, carefully planning every detail. One evening, she decided to share her excitement with Andrew, hoping, deep down, for some encouragement. "I've been thinking about expanding my work into a real business," she said over dinner. "If I market myself better, I could turn this into something big." Andrew barely reacted. He took a bite of his food, then smirked. "A business? Olivia, do you really think there's enough money in making logos? Come on, be serious." His laughter stung more than his words. It wasn't just skepticism, it was outright dismissal. "You're great at what you do," he continued, "but let's be real. You'll never make enough to support yourself, let alone contribute significantly to this household." Olivia stared at her plate, appetite gone. She had wanted to share something meaningful with him, something that gave her purpose. But instead of support, all she received was another reminder that, in his eyes, she would never be enough. Marriage was supposed to be about partnership, about two people supporting each other through life's ups and downs. But Olivia felt more alone than ever. Andrew had once been her best friend, the person she could confide in, the one who made her feel valued. Now, she felt like she was simply occupying space in his life, useful when he needed company at a corporate event, but invisible otherwise. She no longer shared her thoughts with him, knowing that his responses would either be dismissive or laced with subtle ridicule. Some nights, she lay awake while he slept soundly beside her, staring at the ceiling, wondering when everything had changed. She thought about leaving sometimes, about what it would mean to walk away. But every time she considered it, a small voice inside her whispered, *maybe he'll change. Maybe this is just a phase, so she stayed, clinging to the hope that the man she had fallen in love with still existed somewhere beneath the arrogance and indifference. The final straw came at a company gala. Andrew had been drinking, his confidence inflated by a few glasses of expensive whiskey. As he introduced Olivia to his colleagues, his tone was overly casual, almost mocking. "This is my wife, Olivia. She's an artist, well, kind of. She does graphic design, but let's just say we're not retiring on her paycheck anytime soon." The laughter that followed wasn't malicious, but it was humiliating. Olivia felt as though she had been stripped bare in front of strangers, reduced to nothing more than an afterthought in her own marriage. For the first time, she didn't just swallow her pride, she let the pain settle deep within her. That night, when they got home, she said nothing. She simply walked into the bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the floor, hugging her knees. She knew, without a doubt, that Andrew no longer respected her. And without respect, what was left? Something inside Olivia shifted after that night. She didn't argue with Andrew anymore, didn't try to prove herself or fight for his validation. Instead, she poured all of her energy into her work. If he thought she was insignificant, she would prove to herself that she wasn't. She started waking up earlier, taking on more projects, researching ways to expand her business. She stopped waiting for his encouragement, she became her own support system. Andrew barely noticed the change at first. He was too busy basking in his own success, too preoccupied with his own life to see that Olivia was slowly distancing herself. But Olivia noticed. She felt stronger, more in control of her own fate. She no longer needed his approval. And as she built something of her own, she couldn't shake the feeling that one day, the balance between them would shift in ways Andrew never expected. Andrew had always carried himself with unwavering confidence, convinced that his career was untouchable. His firm had been thriving for years, and he was considered one of the top analysts in his division. But behind closed doors, trouble was brewing. A series of bad investments, shifts in the market, and internal restructuring had put the company in a precarious position. Some of his colleagues were quietly preparing for the worst, polishing resumes, networking, making contingency plans. But Andrew dismissed their concerns. "The company won't let go of its best people," he told Olivia one evening when she cautiously mentioned the layoffs she had read about in the news. "I'm too valuable to them." Olivia didn't argue, but she knew arrogance could blind even the smartest people. She had seen the signs, the nervous energy in his voice, the longer hours at the office, the way he avoided discussing the firm's financial state. She wanted to tell him to be careful, to prepare just in case, but she knew how that conversation would go. He would laugh it off, tell her she didn't understand the corporate world, and remind her once again who made the real money in the house. So she stayed silent, watching as the storm clouds gathered over their once stable life, knowing that when the inevitable happened, Andrew wouldn't be ready. It happened on a Monday. Andrew walked into the office as usual, but instead of his morning meeting, he was called into a conference room with HR. The conversation was brief, almost clinical. The company was downsizing, and despite his years of dedication, he was being let go effective immediately. A severance package was handed to him, but it felt like a consolation prize for something he had built his entire identity around. He sat there in stunned silence, the words barely registering. Fired. Laid off. Unemployed. These were things that happened to other people, people who weren't as skilled, as hardworking, as important as he was. When he arrived home that evening, Olivia immediately sensed something was wrong. He dropped his briefcase by the door and sat on the couch without a word. She approached carefully. Andrew? He didn't look at her. I lost my job. The words came out flat, emotionless. Olivia sat beside him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. I'm so sorry, we'll figure something out. But he pulled away, standing abruptly. It's temporary, he muttered, as if saying it aloud would make it true. I'll find something else soon. Olivia nodded, choosing not to press him. But deep inside, she feared that this was only the beginning of something much worse. The first few weeks after his job loss, Andrew remained confident. He sent out applications, scheduled interviews, and convinced himself that he would be back on his feet in no time. But rejection after rejection chipped away at his certainty. The job market was brutal, and for the first time in his life, his qualifications didn't seem to be enough. The roles he wanted weren't available, and the ones that were didn't pay nearly what he was used to. He refused to consider anything beneath his previous salary, insisting that he was better than that. But as weeks turned into months, their savings dwindled, and the bills didn't stop coming. Olivia stepped in, quietly taking on more projects to cover their expenses. She never complained, never threw his past words back at him, even though she had every right to. She simply worked harder, stretching every dollar, making sacrifices that Andrew barely noticed. He was too consumed with his own failure to see that the woman he had once belittled was the only reason they were staying afloat. He barely acknowledged her efforts, as if admitting he needed her help would be another blow to his already shattered ego. And so, resentment festered in the silence between them, unspoken but growing with every passing day. One evening, after yet another rejection, Andrew snapped. He had spent the day making calls, desperately trying to secure something, anything that would bring back his old life. But nothing worked. When he walked into the kitchen and saw Olivia preparing dinner, humming softly to herself, something inside him broke. Must be nice, he muttered bitterly. Olivia turned, confused. What? He scoffed, throwing his hands up. Must be nice to have no real responsibility. To just play around with your little designs while I'm the one carrying the weight of everything. Olivia froze, stunned by the sheer unfairness of his words. Andrew. I've been paying the bills. I've been keeping us afloat. But he wasn't listening. He was too lost in his own frustration, too blinded by his pride to see the truth. If you made more money, we wouldn't be struggling like this, he yelled. The accusation stung, not just because it was cruel, but because deep down, a part of him probably believed it. Olivia clenched her fists, fighting back the urge to cry. She had spent months holding everything together, sacrificing her own peace to support him, and yet here he was blaming her for his failures. In that moment, something inside her shifted. She wasn't sure if she could ever look at him the same way again. Andrew's pride had always been his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. He had built his entire identity around his career, his success, his ability to provide. But now, stripped of everything, he was forced to confront a terrifying truth. Without his job, who was he? He avoided their friends, ignored calls from former colleagues, and refused to admit to himself that he was no longer the man he once was. And yet, even as his world crumbled, he still couldn't bring himself to fully acknowledge the depth of Olivia's sacrifices. He had spent so long looking down on her, belittling her career, that the idea of needing her support made his stomach turn. But the reality was inescapable. One evening, as he checked their bank account, he realized they were weeks away from being unable to afford rent. Panic surged through him. For the first time, he had to face the consequences of his arrogance, and it terrified him. He looked across the room at Olivia, who was working late again, her eyes tired but focused. And in that moment, it hit him, while he had been drowning in self-pity, she had been saving them. He had spent years dismissing her worth, only to now find himself entirely dependent on her. The irony was crushing. But what was worse was the growing fear that it might be too late to fix what he had broken. Andrew's pride had taken many blows, but none compared to what happened one afternoon when he ran into an old colleague. He had gone out to meet a former associate for lunch, hoping to hear about job openings. As he approached the restaurant, he spotted Daniel, a man who had once worked under him. Andrew felt a flicker of relief. Maybe Daniel could offer some leads. But as he approached with a forced smile, Daniel barely looked at him. "Andrew, hey," he said, his tone polite but distant. When Andrew tried to steer the conversation toward work, Daniel hesitated. "Look, man, the industry's changed. A lot of places are looking for fresh talent, younger guys willing to take lower salaries." The implication was clear. Andrew was no longer in demand. What stung even more was how Daniel ended the conversation. "I'd love to chat more, but I've got a meeting with some of the senior partners." Andrew recognized the condescension in his voice, the same tone he had once used with Olivia. As he walked home, hands clenched in his pockets, the weight of his downfall settled heavily on his shoulders. He had spent years believing himself superior to others, mocking those who struggled, looking down on those who didn't make as much as him. And now, he was the one being pitted, the one being brushed aside like an afterthought. That night, Andrew sat at the kitchen table, staring at the bills stacked in front of him. Olivia walked in, her laptop tucked under her arm, exhaustion written across her face. She had been working late almost every night, quietly taking on more responsibilities to cover their expenses. For months, he had ignored the truth, refused to acknowledge how much she had done for them. But as he looked at her now, the realization hit him like a freight train. Without her, he would have nothing. Swallowing his pride, he finally spoke. "Olivia, can we talk?" She hesitated for a moment before sitting across from him. "I need your help," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the hardest thing he had ever said. Olivia didn't gloat, didn't remind him of his past words, even though she had every right to. Instead, she simply nodded. "Okay," she said. "But, Andrew, do you even understand what you've put me through?" He looked down, shame burning through him. "I do," he murmured. "And I don't deserve your kindness." The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken pain. Olivia had been carrying the weight of their survival alone, and now, for the first time, Andrew was forced to acknowledge that she had been stronger than him all along. As Olivia continued working late nights, Andrew started noticing things he had never paid attention to before. Her phone buzzed constantly with emails, her desk was stacked with design drafts, and she was regularly on video calls with clients. One evening, he finally asked, "You've been really busy lately. What exactly are you working on?" Olivia hesitated before answering. "I started my own agency a year ago." Andrew blinked, stunned. "A year ago?" She nodded. "I didn't tell you because I knew you wouldn't take it seriously." The truth hit him harder than he expected. While he had spent years belittling her career, she had quietly built something remarkable. Andrew felt a mix of emotions, shock, admiration, and a bitter taste of regret. "So, you're running an actual company now?" he asked, almost in disbelief. Olivia let out a small, tired laugh. "Yes, Andrew. I have employees. I have clients. I'm making more than enough to support us." His stomach twisted. How had he been so blind? While he had wallowed in self-pity, Olivia had been proving herself in ways he had never imagined. And the most painful part? She had done it without him. For the first time in their marriage, Andrew found himself in unfamiliar territory. Olivia was now the primary provider, and he was the one without direction. The power dynamic had shifted, and he struggled to accept it. When Olivia suggested he help with administrative work at her agency, his pride flared up. "You want me to work for you?" he asked, the bitterness evident in his voice. Olivia met his gaze calmly. "I'm offering you a job, Andrew. If you want it." Her words were neutral, but he could sense the underlying message. She wasn't begging him to take it. She was giving him a choice. Swallowing his pride, he agreed. It wasn't easy. Sitting in an office where Olivia was the one calling the shots was humbling, to say the least. He had to take orders from the woman he had spent years undermining, had to witness firsthand the respect she commanded from her team. And the worst part? She was good at it. She was confident, decisive, and, to his utter humiliation, far more successful than he had ever given her credit for. Every time he looked at her now, he saw not the quiet wife he had once dismissed, but a woman who had built something incredible despite him, not because of him. Andrew sat at his desk, reviewing financial reports for Olivia's agency, his mind heavy with regret. He had spent so many years believing that his worth was tied to his salary, that a man's success was measured by how much money he made. And yet, here he was, sitting in an office run by his wife, depending on her income, relying on her guidance. He thought back to all the times he had mocked her, dismissed her dreams, laughed at the idea of her ever being successful. And now, the irony was unbearable. That evening, as they sat across from each other at dinner, he finally broke the silence. "Olivia, I need to say something." She looked up from her plate, waiting. He exhaled, the words heavy on his tongue. "I was wrong. About everything. About you, about your work, about the way I treated you." His voice wavered, thick with guilt. "I was so caught up in my own ego that I didn't see you. I didn't respect you the way I should have." Olivia studied him for a long moment before speaking. "I know," she said simply. No anger, no resentment, just quiet acknowledgement. And somehow, that hurt more than any argument ever could. Because now, Andrew wasn't just facing the consequences of his mistakes, he was facing the terrifying reality that he might have already lost the one person who had truly stood by him. Andrew had never imagined himself in a position where he needed Olivia's help. For years, he had viewed himself as the provider, the one who held their household together. But now, as he sat in her office, watching her confidently run meetings and delegate tasks, he realized how much he had underestimated her. One evening, as she worked late, he hesitated before speaking. I want to do more here, he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. Olivia looked up, studying him carefully. You mean actually work? She asked, not out of malice, but because she needed to be sure he was serious. He nodded. I need to prove to myself that I can still be useful. Olivia sighed, setting her laptop aside. Andrew, this isn't charity. If you work for me, you work, no special treatment. The words stung, but he understood why she said them. She wasn't offering him an easy way out, she was giving him a chance to rebuild himself. And this time, he wasn't in control. He would have to earn her trust, just as she had spent years earning his respect while he looked down on her. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but he nodded. I understand. And with that, his new reality began. Working under Olivia was harder than Andrew expected. He had assumed his years in finance would make him an asset to her company, but he quickly realized how little he knew about her world. The clients she worked with didn't care about corporate jargon or impressive job titles, they valued creativity, precision, and the ability to bring ideas to life. Olivia's team was talented, and he found himself struggling to keep up. Every task felt like a challenge, every meeting a reminder that he was no longer the most important person in the room. His first real test came when Olivia assigned him to a research project, something mundane but necessary. This needs to be done by Friday, she told him, treating him no differently than any other employee. Andrew almost protested, but he caught himself. He had once mocked her work, acted as if it were beneath him. Now, here he was, doing the same kind of tasks he had belittled. He spent hours poring over details, determined to prove himself. And when he handed Olivia the completed report, she simply nodded. Good work, she said. There was no fanfare, no special praise, just a quiet acknowledgement that he had done his job. And for the first time in months, he felt a small sense of pride. It wasn't long before Andrew encountered people who remembered who he used to be. At an industry event Olivia invited him to, he ran into former acquaintances, people who once admired him, who had laughed at his jokes when he belittled Olivia's career. But things had changed. Now, they barely acknowledged him, their conversations shifting toward Olivia instead. Your wife has built something incredible, one of them said, offering her a congratulatory handshake. Andrew forced a smile, but the words felt like a slap. The most painful moment came when an old colleague, one he had frequently spoken down to, greeted Olivia warmly but barely looked at him. Olivia, I've heard so much about your agency. It's impressive how far you've come. Then, with a quick glance at Andrew, he added, must be interesting working for her now. The comment was casual, but the humiliation burned deep. For years, Andrew had been the one in control, the one who was admired. Now, he was an afterthought, a man who had lost everything, while his wife had risen to success. And the worst part? He had no one to blame but himself. Andrew had spent months trying to regain a sense of purpose, but it wasn't until a small but significant moment at work that he realized something had shifted within him. One afternoon, Olivia was deep in a meeting when a crisis arose. One of her biggest clients was reconsidering their contract. Normally, Andrew would have stayed quiet, unsure of his place. But this time, he stepped in. Drawing from his financial experience, he proposed a strategy to reassure the client, explaining how their partnership could be mutually beneficial. Olivia listened, then nodded. That could work, she admitted, instructing her team to implement his suggestion. Later that evening, Olivia approached him. "That was a good call today," she said. "You handled it well." It was the first time in a long time that she had looked at him with something other than disappointment. And for Andrew, that meant more than any promotion he had ever received. He realized then that respect wasn't something given, it was something earned. And if he wanted to repair what he had broken, he had to keep proving, not just to Olivia but to himself, that he was capable of change. One evening, as they cleaned up after dinner, Andrew finally spoke the words he had been holding in for months. "Olivia, I was horrible to you." She paused, setting down a plate, but didn't respond right away. He continued, his voice raw with guilt. "I spent years looking down on you, making you feel like you weren't enough. And all that time, you were building something incredible. I was too arrogant to see it." Olivia sighed, leaning against the counter. "You were," she admitted, her tone not cruel, just honest. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," he continued. "But I need you to know that I see it now. I see you. And I respect you more than I ever did before." Olivia studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. "I spent years wanting to hear those words," she said softly. "But words alone don't change things, Andrew. Actions do." He nodded, understanding. He had spent so long dismissing her, underestimating her. Now, if he wanted to be worthy of her again, he would have to prove it, not with promises, but with effort, with consistency, with humility. And for the first time, he was ready to do just that. For years, Olivia had swallowed her pain, choosing silence over confrontation. But now, as she sat across from Andrew at the dining table, she realized it was time to say the words she had been holding back. "Do you know how much it hurt?" she asked, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. Andrew looked at her, guilt evident in his eyes. "Every time you dismissed my work, every time you joked about my income, it chipped away at me. I started believing you, that I wasn't enough, that what I did didn't matter." Her hands trembled slightly, but she held her ground. "And the worst part? I loved you anyway. I stayed. I supported you even when you never supported me." Andrew swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had always thought of himself as strong, but now he saw Olivia for what she truly was, stronger than he had ever been. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he admitted, voice hoarse. "But I swear, I will never make you feel that way again." Olivia studied him for a long moment before sighing. "I don't want empty promises, Andrew. I want respect. I want to know that if we move forward, you truly see me as your equal." He nodded, knowing that no words could undo the past, but that his actions from now on would determine their future. The tension between them lingered, even as they continued working together. Olivia had opened the door for reconciliation, but Andrew knew she wasn't fully convinced yet. And maybe she never would be. The damage he had done couldn't be erased overnight. For the first time, he wondered if love alone was enough. Could they truly rebuild after everything he had put her through? Or had too much been broken beyond repair? The uncertainty gnawed at him, and for the first time in his life, he realized he wasn't in control of the outcome. It wasn't his decision to make, it was hers. One night, Olivia stayed late at the office, and Andrew found himself sitting alone in their apartment, the silence deafening. He looked around at the home they had built together and felt the crushing weight of his regrets. He had spent years belittling the woman who had saved him, and now, she was the one with the power to decide whether they had a future. He had lost his job, his status, and nearly his marriage. But losing Olivia entirely? That was something he wasn't sure he could survive. Determined to show Olivia that he had truly changed, Andrew took action. He spent weeks secretly working on something meaningful, a full rebranding strategy for her company. He used his financial expertise to refine her business plan, outlining ways she could expand without compromising her creative vision. He wasn't doing it to prove his intelligence or assert control, he was doing it because, for the first time, he genuinely wanted to support her the way she had supported him. One evening, he placed the folder on her desk. "I did this for you," he said simply. "No expectations. Just because I believe in you." Olivia opened the folder, flipping through the pages carefully. As she read, Andrew watched her expression shift from curiosity to something unreadable. When she finally looked up, there was something different in her eyes, not forgiveness, not yet, but something close. "This is really good," she admitted. "You didn't have to do this." Andrew exhaled. "I did, Olivia. I should have been doing this all along." She nodded slowly, as if truly seeing him for the first time in a long while. And for the first time, hope flickered between them. The following weeks brought an unspoken shift between them. Olivia no longer carried the same guarded distance, and Andrew no longer felt like he was simply trying to undo his mistakes. He was finally learning what it meant to be a real partner. He supported her without hesitation, took initiative without expecting praise, and, most importantly, he listened. Their conversations changed, becoming deeper, more meaningful. It was no longer about proving himself but about understanding her, about making sure she never felt small again. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Olivia finally spoke. "I think I want to try again," she said cautiously. Andrew's breath caught. "You do?" She nodded, looking at him with the same warmth she used to have. "But I need to know that this isn't temporary. That this version of you, the one who respects me, who values me, is real." He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "It is, Olivia. And I will spend the rest of my life proving that to you." For the first time in a long time, she smiled. And in that moment, Andrew knew that while the past couldn't be erased, the future was still theirs to build. Andrew had learned many things throughout his downfall and redemption, but the most important lesson of all was this: success wasn't measured by money, but by the way you treated the people who stood by you. He had spent years believing his worth was tied to his income, that power and status defined a man. But Olivia had shown him something greater. True strength wasn't about being the provider, but about being present, about being supportive, about lifting each other up instead of tearing each other down. As they walked into her office together one morning, side by side, he no longer saw her as the woman who needed his validation. She was his equal, his partner, the person who had saved him in every way that mattered. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't threatened by it, he was proud. Proud of her, proud of the life they were rebuilding, and most of all, proud that he had finally learned to be the kind of man she truly deserved.